The beginning of love and hope. Kofi stood at the edge of the bustling University of Ghana campus, his suitcase heavy in his hand, filled with both clothes and dreams. Born in a small village in the Ashanti region, Kofi had always felt the weight of his humble beginnings. The dusty roads of his village had taught him resilience, but they also made him yearn for something greater, a future that promised hope and opportunity. Now, as he stood in the heart of the city, surrounded by a world he had only seen in books, he felt a surge of excitement. This was it. His chance for a better life. He had arrived at the university with only one thing in mind, to build a future that would not only change his life but also the lives of his family. But there was one thing Kofi hadn't planned for: love. Meeting Akosua. Akosua was everything Kofi wasn't. She was confident, smart, and from a background that spoke of privilege. Her father was a respected businessman in Accra, and her mother had a successful catering business. As she walked across the campus, she radiated an energy that made heads turn. With her sharp mind and poised demeanor, Akosua was already popular among her peers, effortlessly blending into her new life as a university student. It wasn't long before their paths crossed. During the first days of orientation, Kofi found himself in the same group as Akosua. He had noticed her from afar, captivated by the way she carried herself. Her every word seemed to hold wisdom, and her smile, though rare, could light up a room. What really caught Kofi's attention, however, was her kindness. When the group was split into smaller teams for an introductory task, it was Akosua who noticed him struggling to organize his thoughts. She smiled warmly and offered to help him, her voice soft but confident. Her presence made Kofi feel seen, and for the first time, he felt like maybe he could belong in this world. Their conversations were easy, and soon, Kofi found himself spending more time with her. Akosua, in turn, admired his quiet determination and humble nature. He didn't have the flashy clothes or the confident demeanor that the other students had, but there was something in his eyes, a fire to rise above his circumstances. Akosua liked that about him. Bonding over shared goals and struggles. As the semester progressed, Kofi and Akosua became fast friends. They spent late nights studying together, often in the quiet corners of the library. Akosua would bring him books to help with his studies, and Kofi would lend her notes on topics she found difficult. They found strength in each other's company, as if they were two pieces of a puzzle that had been waiting to fit together. Kofi soon learned that Akosua, despite her wealthy background, faced her own battles. She was often under pressure to live up to her parents' expectations, a burden that weighed heavily on her. Though she never complained, Kofi could see the subtle cracks in her perfect exterior. For the first time, he saw her as someone who, like him, was working hard to secure her future. Akosua, on the other hand, was touched by Kofi's resilience and his unwavering optimism. He would often talk about his dreams for his family and how he planned to use his education to bring about change in his community. It didn't take long before their friendship began to evolve into something deeper. Kofi found himself thinking about Akosua more than anyone else. She was different, her kindness, her intellect, and her strength made her stand out among the crowd. And Akosua, too, began to notice the way her heart would skip a beat every time Kofi smiled at her or looked at her with those kind, sincere eyes. She admired his ambition and loved his gentle spirit. It wasn't long before Kofi realized that he had fallen in love with her. He didn't know when it happened, whether it was the quiet moments they shared over books or the way Akosua would encourage him when he doubted himself, but one day, it just hit him. Akosua was more than just a friend, she was the person he wanted to share his future with. Struggles in their early relationship. Despite the growing love between them, Kofi couldn't escape the shadow of his past. While Akosua came from a family that never had to worry about money, Kofi constantly worried about his finances. His parents had sacrificed everything to send him to school, and he knew that he couldn't afford to waste this opportunity. Akosua, however, had the means to help him. She would buy him lunch when he couldn't afford it, pay for his textbooks when they were too expensive, and even help him with accommodation fees when he struggled to make ends meet. At first, Kofi felt grateful for Akojoa's support, but as time went on, he started to feel embarrassed. He began to believe that he wasn't worthy of her. He would look at her in the university halls, surrounded by friends with money and influence, and feel like an outsider. He began to feel inferior. Akojoa would tell him that he didn't need to worry about it, that she loved him for who he was, but Kofi couldn't shake the feeling that he was a burden to her. Akojoa, on the other hand, continued to pour her heart into their relationship. She didn't see Kofi as a project to fix or a charity case. She saw him as the man she loved. But her attempts to reassure him often went unheard, as Kofi was consumed by his insecurities. The weight of his own doubts began to strain their relationship. The more Akojoa tried to help, the more Kofi withdrew into himself. But despite the tension, they continued to support each other, driven by their shared dreams of a better future. Kofi, though unsure of his worth, believed in the strength of their bond. And Akojoa, despite the struggles, believed in Kofi's potential to rise above his circumstances. Their relationship, though still in its early stages, became a journey of learning and growing together. They knew the road ahead would not be easy, but they were determined to face it side by side. And in the back of their minds, they both held onto the hope that love, true love, would see them through, no matter what. Success and the change in Kofi. Graduation and a new life. The day of graduation was one that Kofi would never forget. As he stood in his cap and gown, a sea of proud graduates all around him, he couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. It had been a long journey, filled with challenges, late nights, and moments of self-doubt. But he had made it. His heart swelled with pride as he looked at Akojoa, standing beside him in her own gown, her eyes sparkling with joy. She had been with him every step of the way, and now, they were both ready to face the world. Graduating with top honors in business administration, Kofi was offered a position at a prestigious firm in Accra. The offer came quickly, and so did the promise of a better life. Akojoa, with her degree in finance, landed a high-paying job at a multinational bank. Both of them were on the fast track to success, their dreams finally within reach. For Kofi, the move to Accra was more than just a career shift, it was the beginning of something new. The city was buzzing with energy, filled with opportunity and promise. Kofi no longer had to worry about his parents' financial strain or whether he could afford to eat. For the first time in his life, money was no longer a concern. Akojoa, too, thrived in the city, and together they painted a picture of success. They moved into a modern apartment in a posh neighborhood. Akojoa bought new clothes, and Kofi treated himself to his first new car, something sleek, something that reflected his new life. They were living the dream they had talked about for years. The transformation of Kofi's character. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Kofi's life changed in ways he hadn't anticipated. With his newfound wealth and status came a shift in his personality. Kofi, who had once been humble and focused solely on his future, now found himself consumed by the world around him. He became obsessed with appearances, his clothes, his car, his social status. He spent more money on extravagant suits, luxury watches, and expensive colognes, thinking that these things would make him feel complete. At first, Akojoa didn't mind the changes. She was proud of Kofi's success. But soon, she began to notice subtle shifts in his behavior. He no longer had time for the quiet, intimate moments they once shared. He was constantly preoccupied with his phone, texting and calling colleagues late into the night. The late-night conversations that used to be reserved for her were now being shared with people she didn't know. Kofi started going out more, leaving Akojoa alone at home, telling her he had work events or meetings to attend. Akojua understood that work was demanding, but she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. Kofi became distant, his once genuine smiles were now forced, his eyes often clouded with thoughts of something else. He began to surround himself with a new crowd, people who were more interested in the high life than anything else. Kofi would spend hours at clubs, socializing with strangers, laughing and drinking as if he had forgotten about the woman who had stood by him through every hardship. Akojua felt a growing emptiness. She couldn't understand where the man she had fallen in love with had gone. The first signs of betrayal. One evening, as Kofi was getting ready for another important business dinner, Akojua noticed his phone lying on the coffee table. It buzzed with a new message, a message from a woman named Elsie. Akojua didn't intend to snip, but the curiosity gnawed at her. She picked up the phone, her heart racing. The message read, "I can't wait to see you tonight. Let's make this evening unforgettable." Akojua's breath caught in her throat. She quickly locked the phone and put it back on the table, her hands shaking. A cold wave of disbelief washed over her. She couldn't breathe. Kofi had always been open with her about his work, but now, it was clear something was amiss. Kofi returned home later that night, his demeanor as carefree as ever. He smiled at Akojua, kissed her on the cheek, and made small talk about his meeting. But Akojua couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. Her gut twisted with the uncertainty that had started to creep into her heart. The next day, Akojua could no longer ignore the voice in her head. She found herself going back to Kofi's phone, this time searching through his messages, and what she found made her blood run cold. The messages from Elsie were just the beginning. There were more. Many more. There were flirtatious texts from different women, all of them suggesting intimacy, laughter, and secrets shared behind her back. Her heart shattered in an instant. She had trusted him. She had believed that they were building something beautiful together, but this was a betrayal. The confrontation. Akojua couldn't hold back any longer. That evening, when Kofi returned home, she confronted him, her voice trembling with emotion. "Who is Elsie?" she demanded, holding up his phone in front of him. Kofi froze, his face momentarily turning pale. He had never expected Akojua to discover his secret life, the one he had been hiding for months. He looked away, avoiding her gaze, and then muttered, "She's just a colleague." Akojua's heart dropped. "A colleague," she repeated, her voice rising. "Is that how you explain these messages? You've been lying to me, Kofi." She wanted to scream, to shout, but she stayed calm, though every fiber of her being wanted to crumble. "Why? Why would you do this to me?" Kofi shifted uncomfortably, running a hand through his hair. He hadn't expected Akojua to confront him this way. He hadn't expected her to be so hurt, so broken by his actions. "Akojua, I'm sorry. I never meant for you to find out. It was a mistake. I promise it won't happen again." But Akojua could hear the hesitation in his voice. She could feel the lies crawling into his words. "I don't believe you," she whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "How could you do this to me? After everything I've done for you?" Kofi reached out to her, but Akojua pulled away, her eyes filled with both pain and anger. "I gave you everything, Kofi. I trusted you. And this is how you repay me." Kofi stood there, silent. He could see the anguish in her face, but the truth was that he had already made his choice. He was too far gone, too consumed by his new life, and part of him was ready to move on, no matter how much it hurt her. Akojua took a deep breath, wiping her eyes. She couldn't stay in this toxic relationship, not if Kofi wasn't going to respect her. But a part of her, an aching part of her, still believed in their love. She wanted to believe that things could go back to normal. That the man she once loved would return. "I want to trust you," she said softly, her voice breaking. "But I can't. Not after this." Kofi's face fell as he saw the determination in her eyes. But still, he apologized, swearing that things would change. Akosua, torn between her love for him and her dignity, reluctantly chose to believe him one last time, praying that this wasn't the end. But deep inside, she knew things would never be the same again. The unraveling of trust. The escalation of Kofi's infidelity. Despite Kofi's promises that things would change, nothing improved. If anything, his infidelity grew bolder, more frequent, and harder to ignore. He continued to disappear for hours at a time, attending work meetings that never seemed to end or going out with colleagues who were anything but professional. Akosua, still holding on to the hope that their relationship could survive, noticed the little signs, the lingering scent of perfume on Kofi's clothes, the missed calls he would quickly dismiss, the sudden need for him to work late when there was no real reason for it. One night, everything fell apart. Akosua, unable to shake the feeling that Kofi was hiding something, followed him after he left the apartment. Her heart pounded as she trailed him through the busy streets of Accra. She watched from a distance as he met a woman outside a restaurant, a beautiful woman, laughing as Kofi kissed her cheek before they entered the building together. Akosua's world tilted. She had suspected for months, but seeing him with her, so carefree and happy, was a punch to the gut. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She turned on her heel and walked away, her hands shaking uncontrollably. The pain was unbearable. She had given everything to Kofi, her heart, her trust, her love, and he had thrown it all away for someone else. Akosua's internal struggle. For the next few days, Akosua was a ghost. She moved through life as if she were on autopilot, her mind consumed by thoughts of Kofi's betrayal. She couldn't stop imagining the woman's face, the way Kofi had looked at her with affection, something Akosua hadn't seen in months. Every moment felt like a crushing weight pressing down on her chest. She tried to talk to Kofi about it, but every time she brought it up, he dismissed her concerns. "You're being paranoid," he would say. "It's nothing. You're overreacting, Akosua." His words cut deeper than she wanted to admit. She had trusted him completely, and yet he treated her like she was the problem, like her pain was just a passing inconvenience. Every apology seemed hollow, every promise to change felt meaningless. Akosua felt trapped. Her love for Kofi had blinded her to the truth for so long, but now that she saw it, she didn't know how to escape. She had built her entire world around him. Her dreams, her future, they all centered on him. Letting go felt like letting go of her own identity, like giving up on everything she had worked so hard to create with him. The worst part was the guilt. She didn't know how to stop loving him, even though she knew he didn't deserve her. Her heart wanted to hold on, to believe that he could change, but her mind was screaming at her to walk away. The first major breakdown. As the days passed, Akosua became consumed by her obsession with Kofi's infidelity. She could no longer focus on her job or her friends. All she could think about was Kofi, where he was, who he was with, and what he was doing. She started to follow him more often, watching him from a distance as he laughed with other women, never noticing the pain in her eyes. One evening, Akosua found herself outside a bar, watching Kofi through the window, his arm around a woman she had never seen before. Her blood boiled as she saw the way he held her, the way he smiled and whispered something into her ear. Akosua's mind spiraled, and she stormed inside, ignoring the shocked looks of the patrons. She went straight to Kofi, grabbing his arm. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice barely above a whisper but filled with fury. "Another one." Kofi stood frozen, his face full of surprise and, for a moment, guilt. The woman he was with looked confused, unsure of who Akosua was. Kofi looked between the two of them, trying to find the words, but nothing came. Akojua didn't wait for an explanation. "You're a liar," she spat, before turning on her heel and walking out. But as she stepped into the cool night air, she felt a wave of hopelessness crash over her. She couldn't keep doing this. Confronting him, confronting his women, tearing herself apart over someone who didn't respect her. But she couldn't stop herself. She was drowning in the need to know, to catch him in the act, to prove to herself that he had truly chosen someone else. The decision to hold on at all cost. The following weeks were a blur. Akojua became more and more obsessed with Kofi's every move. She lost herself in the chase, determined to stop any woman who dared to get too close to him. She showed up at his office unannounced, demanding to know who he had been texting. She followed him to social events, watching from the shadows, just waiting for him to slip up. She even confronted women she didn't know, accusing them of trying to steal him away from her. Her friends and family began to notice the changes in her. They saw the hollow look in her eyes, the way she had stopped caring about everything else in her life. "Akojua, this isn't you," her best friend said one day, trying to intervene. "You're losing yourself. This isn't healthy. Why can't you just leave him?" But Akojua couldn't hear it. "Who else would I have?" she snapped. "I've invested too much into this. I've given him everything. I won't let someone else come in and take him away." She was determined to keep Kofi at any cost, even if it meant destroying herself in the process. Every woman who came into Kofi's life was a threat to her, and she would not let them win. Akojua couldn't let go. Not now. Not after everything she had sacrificed. Her obsession with Kofi's betrayal consumed her every waking moment. She no longer cared about her job, her friends, or even her own well-being. The only thing that mattered was Kofi, and making sure no other woman would take her place. She had become a prisoner of her own love, and she didn't know how to escape. The dark path of revenge. Akojua's obsession grows. As weeks turned into months, Akojua's obsession with Kofi's infidelities spiraled out of control. Her mind no longer functioned as it once had. She was consumed by the need to hurt him, to make him feel the same pain she had endured. She couldn't escape the images of Kofi laughing with other women, his affection for them burning a hole in her heart every time she saw it. The more she saw, the more desperate she became. She started by targeting Kofi's mistresses, one by one. The first was Elsie, the woman whose message had initially broken her. Akojua made sure that Elsie's reputation took a hit. She used her influence at work to spread rumors about her, sowing doubt among Elsie's colleagues. Akojua knew exactly how to use her connections to tarnish the woman's professional image. Soon, Elsie found herself isolated, with people whispering behind her back. The humiliation was unbearable, but Akojua was relentless. Next, she went after a woman named Kofi had met at a business conference, a woman who had caught his eye the moment Akojua wasn't looking. Akojua made sure to appear in the woman's favorite cafe, confronting her publicly and accusing her of trying to ruin her marriage. She would embarrass them, humiliate them, and expose them for what they were, nothing more than obstacles in her way. Every confrontation felt like a small victory, and Akojua was high on the power it gave her. But the victories didn't feel as sweet as she thought they would. Each time she caused chaos in one of Kofi's lovers' lives, her own sense of satisfaction seemed to fade quicker than it arrived. She couldn't stop herself. She had crossed a line, but she didn't care. She was obsessed with seeing them suffer, convinced that ruining these women would somehow make her feel whole again. The turning point. As time passed, Akojua's obsession with revenge became more all-consuming. She no longer cared about the future they had once built together or the woman she had been. The Akojua who had once dreamed of success and happiness was a shadow of herself now, an angry, vengeful woman who would stop at nothing to make Kofi feel the way she did. Her friends grew concerned, but Akojua ignored them. "I'm fine," she would tell them, though her eyes betrayed her. She was far from fine. Every moment was spent plotting her next move, imagining how she could destroy the woman who had taken what she thought was hers. She followed them, watching their every move. She showed up unannounced, barging into their lives, tearing them apart with her words. Akosua believed that if she couldn't have Kofi, no one else could. Her life revolved around these confrontations. She stopped caring about her job, stopped caring about her health. She was falling apart from the inside, but she didn't care. She had nothing left to lose. Each day, she became more erratic, more unpredictable. She no longer recognized the person she had become, but at the same time, she was addicted to the chaos. It was the only thing that numbed the pain of knowing Kofi had chosen someone else. The rise of a new woman, Nana. Then, one day, Kofi met someone new, a woman named Nana. She was everything Akosua was not: calm, assertive, and unapologetically confident. She didn't care about Kofi's past or his baggage. She wasn't intimidated by Akosua's previous attempts to intimidate Kofi's mistresses. Nana had come from a place of strength, and she knew exactly what she wanted. Kofi, drawn to her unwavering confidence, found himself attracted to Nana in a way he hadn't felt before. Akosua heard about Nana soon enough. She felt a familiar rush of jealousy and rage. But Nana was different. She didn't cower under Akosua's threats or disappear in the face of intimidation. Instead, she stood her ground, unbothered by the accusations Akosua had leveled against her. Nana confronted Akosua directly, not with anger, but with a cool, measured calmness that only added fuel to Akosua's fiery rage. "I'm not scared of you," Nana told her. "You can try all you want, but I'm not going anywhere." This response sent Akosua into a spiral. How dare this woman, this stranger, speak to her like that? She had fought so hard for Kofi's attention, and now this woman was just waltzing in, claiming what Akosua believed was hers. Akosua's breaking point. Akosua's obsession with Nana reached its peak. She couldn't let Nana win. She couldn't let her destroy the last piece of the life she had once hoped to have with Kofi. Akosua became more unhinged with every passing day. She began to stalk Nana, showing up at her favorite spots, making her presence known in the most terrifying ways. She would stand outside Nana's apartment building, her eyes glaring with intensity as she watched the woman from afar. But it wasn't enough to just watch Nana. Akosua needed to ruin her, just like she had ruined the others. She started spreading rumors about Nana, telling anyone who would listen that she was nothing but a gold digger. Akosua even staged scenes where she made it appear as though Nana had tried to steal from her. It was all calculated, twisted. Then, one evening, Akosua took it further. She had heard about an event where Kofi and Nana would both be attending, and she knew this was her chance. She showed up at the event, eyes scanning the room for Nana. When she found her, Akosua wasted no time. She marched straight up to Nana and began shouting at her, accusing her of everything she had already said, of being a homewrecker, of trying to steal her life. She wasn't even aware of the people gathering around, watching the scene unfold. The confrontation became violent when Akosua pushed Nana, knocking her to the ground. Security rushed to break up the fight, but it was too late. Nana's composure shattered in that moment, and Kofi, who had witnessed everything from a distance, stood frozen, unsure of what to do. The tension in the room was thick, and everyone could feel the chaos that Akosua had unleashed. Akosua had crossed a line, but she didn't care. In her mind, this was the only way to get Kofi back. She was willing to destroy everything, herself, Nana, even Kofi's future, with her vengeful obsession. But in the end, nothing felt like the victory she had imagined. Her heart remained empty, and the more she fought, the more she lost herself in the darkness, the ultimate betrayal and the consequences. Akosua's final act of revenge. Akosua's obsession had reached an uncontrollable point. Every moment of her life had been consumed by the need to exact revenge on Kofi and destroy anyone who threatened the life she thought she had built with him. Nana had crossed the final line in Akojoa's mind. The woman wasn't just a rival, she was the person who had taken away everything Akojoa had worked for, the love, the time, the future she thought she would share with Kofi. After the violent altercation at the event, where Akojoa had humiliated Nana in front of Kofi, the world seemed to fall into a strange, silent chaos. The aftermath of that scene lingered in Akojoa's mind, but the anger didn't fade. If anything, it only intensified. The more she thought about Nana, the more consumed she became by the idea that Nana had to be removed from the picture permanently. Akojoa could not bear the thought of Kofi being with Nana. In her twisted mind, Nana had stolen her life and was now going to take Kofi's heart away from her forever. Akojoa began to devise her plan. She knew Nana's routine, her favorite places, and her home. Nana was living in a quiet apartment on the outskirts of the city, a place that felt untouched by the chaos Akojoa had created in her own life. But Akojoa saw it as a sanctuary, one that needed to be destroyed. She couldn't simply walk away from the life she had envisioned with Kofi. If she couldn't have him, then no one could. The tragic event. One night, driven by the rage that had been building inside her for so long, Akojoa put her plan into motion. She gathered the necessary supplies, gasoline, a few matches, and a sense of finality in her heart. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the exhilaration of finally taking control of the situation. Akojoa drove to Nana's apartment under the cover of darkness, her thoughts swirling with memories of Kofi's laughter and the moments he had shared with Nana. Every step she took felt like a step toward reclaiming what she believed was rightfully hers. She poured gasoline around Nana's apartment building, taking her time to cover every corner, every inch. As the fire began to take hold, Akojoa stood there, watching the flames climb higher and higher. In her mind, she had won. Nana would be gone, and Kofi would have no choice but to return to her. She would be the one left standing, the one who had fought to the bitter end. She would be the woman Kofi couldn't forget. But the fire spread quickly, more rapidly than she had anticipated. The flames consumed the building, and the smoke billowed into the night sky. Akojoa stayed for a moment, watching, breathing in the hot air, the rush of victory filling her chest. It wasn't until she turned and walked away that the full weight of what she had done began to hit her. But by then, it was too late. Nana was gone, and Akojoa believed she had reclaimed what was hers. The fallout. The news of the fire spread quickly. Reports of a deadly blaze in Nana's apartment building filled the radio and news outlets. Emergency services arrived too late to save Nana. The tragedy was deemed an accident, a result of faulty wiring or an unforeseen mishap. But the whispers on the street were different. The connections that Akojoa had so carefully cultivated in her life had begun to unravel. People knew too much, and her behavior had been too erratic. There were too many signs pointing toward Akojoa. It didn't take long for the police to start piecing things together. Witnesses came forward, describing a woman who had been seen near the building hours before the fire broke out. The pieces of the puzzle started to fall into place. Akojoa had been seen lurking near Nana's home more than once, and her involvement in the altercation at the event was still fresh in everyone's minds. The investigation began to focus on Akojoa. Her obsessive behavior, the threats, the confrontations, all of it pointed toward one dark conclusion. Akojoa was arrested for the murder of Nana. The police had enough evidence to charge her with premeditated murder. Akojoa was taken into custody, her once proud demeanor now shattered. She was no longer the woman who had stood tall at the university, full of dreams and hope. She was broken, a shell of the person she had once been. Her mind, once sharp and calculating, had descended into madness. She was no longer in control of her actions, she had become a victim of her own obsession. Kofi's reaction. Kofi was devastated when he heard the news of Nana's death. He had never expected this, never imagined that things would escalate so far. Nana was gone, and with her, Kofi lost the one thing he had come to care about deeply. The realization hit him like a wave, and for a moment, he was lost in the grief. He couldn't understand why things had gone this far. He had tried to push Akosua away, tried to distance himself from her as best he could, but it had never been enough. But as the shock wore off, something even darker took hold of Kofi's heart. He began to realize the extent of Akosua's madness. The woman he had once loved, the woman he had promised to build a life with, had become a stranger. He had seen her obsessive behavior, but he had never imagined it would lead to something like this. He could not shake the thought that he, too, had played a role in this destruction. His betrayer had pushed Akosua to the brink, and now an innocent life had been lost because of it. Kofi attended the trial, though his presence was nothing more than a formality. He sat in the back of the courtroom, his face expressionless, as the evidence against Akosua was laid bare. She was unrecognizable to him now. The woman who had once been so full of love and ambition had become a cold and broken figure, consumed by jealousy and rage. When Akosua was sentenced to life in prison, Kofi didn't react. His eyes, once full of warmth, were now empty and detached. He had lost Nana, and now he was losing Akosua, the woman who had been by his side for so long. But in that moment, he felt nothing. The love he once had for her was buried under layers of guilt, anger, and regret. The trial ended with Akosua's conviction, and she was led away, her life now a ruin. Kofi watched her go, feeling nothing but the cold weight of his own decisions. He had lost everything. The trial, realization, and final consequences. The courtroom drama. The courtroom was filled with tension as Akosua sat at the defendant's table, her face a mask of cold detachment. The trial was a spectacle, a tragic reflection of everything that had gone wrong in her life. The gallery was packed with spectators, many of whom whispered about the once proud woman who had now descended into madness. Her obsession with Kofi, her vengeful pursuit of his lovers, and ultimately her horrifying act of arson had shocked the entire city. Witnesses were called to testify, each one describing Akosua's behavior in chilling detail. The police officer who had arrested her spoke about the strange calmness Akosua had exhibited when she was taken into custody, as if she had expected the consequences all along. A colleague from her former workplace testified about her erratic behavior, how she had stopped caring about her job or her personal relationships, consumed only by her need for revenge. And then there were the women, the victims of Akosua's wrath. They told their stories of being publicly humiliated, of having their personal lives torn apart by Akosua's calculated actions. One woman, who had once dated Kofi, described how Akosua had shown up at her house late one night, screaming at her, accusing her of being a homewrecker. It wasn't the first time Akosua had terrorized someone, and as the stories piled up, it became clear that her obsession had led her down a dark path. Kofi sat in the back of the courtroom, a hollow figure in the sea of people. His face was unreadable, distant, as he stared at Akosua. He had not been a witness in the case, but his presence loomed over the entire trial. He hadn't spoken to Akosua in months, and now, as the woman he had once loved faced the consequences of her actions, he felt nothing but emptiness. Akosua's world was falling apart. The life she had once dreamed of, the future she had worked so hard to build, was now in ruins. But Kofi barely seemed to notice her presence in the courtroom. His gaze never lingered on her, and his indifference stung Akosua more than anything else. The defense and verdict. Akosua's lawyer argued that she had been pushed to the brink by betrayal. He painted her as a woman who had been driven mad by Kofi's infidelity, by the constant humiliation she had endured, and by the crushing weight of disappointment that had slowly eaten away at her sanity. "My client is not a cold-blooded murderer," the lawyer insisted. She is a woman who lost herself in the face of overwhelming emotional trauma. But the prosecution saw things differently. They painted Akosua as a woman consumed by vengeance, someone who had become obsessed with punishing the women who had come between her and Kofi. They described her actions as premeditated and calculated, showing that Akosua had planned Nana's murder long before the fire that had taken her life. The evidence was damning, and there was no doubt in the minds of the jurors that Akosua was guilty of the crime. As the judge deliberated, Akosua sat still, her eyes fixed on nothing in particular. She no longer cared about the outcome of the trial. She was numb to it all. Her fate had already been sealed long ago. The verdict came down like a hammer. Akosua was found guilty of premeditated murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The courtroom fell silent, and Akosua's heart sank. It was over. Everything was over. Her life, once full of dreams, now felt like a nightmare that she couldn't wake up from. The walls of the courtroom closed in on her, and she was led away, her hands shackled as the reality of her actions crashed down upon her. She had lost Kofi, lost herself, and now she had lost her freedom. The aftermath of Akosua's life in prison. Akosua's life in prison was far from the luxury she had once imagined. The once proud woman who had stood tall, filled with ambition, was now a shell of her former self. The bitterness that had consumed her for so long festered inside her, eating away at what was left of her sanity. She spent her days in a haze of regret, replaying every decision that had led her to this point. She couldn't stop thinking about Kofi, the man she had once loved so deeply, the man who had betrayed her. Her obsession with him still consumed her thoughts. She thought about the life they had almost built, the future that had been torn apart. She thought about Nana, the woman who had replaced her, the woman who had taken everything from her. But the most painful thought of all was that Kofi had moved on. He had continued his life without her, without a second thought. Akosua had thought that if she held on tight enough, she could make him love her again. But now, in the cold silence of her prison cell, she realized the truth. Kofi had never loved her the way she had loved him. And he had never cared enough to stop her from destroying herself. The final twist. Months passed, and Akosua's anger and regret festered. She had become obsessed not just with Kofi, but with the idea that he would one day return to her. She fantasized about the day he would visit her in prison, begging for her forgiveness, telling her that he still loved her. But that day never came. Instead, Kofi did the unthinkable. He visited her, but not as the man who had once been her partner. He arrived with a new wife, a woman who was everything Akosua was not. Kofi had moved on. He had rebuilt his life, and the woman he had chosen was now standing by his side. Akosua could barely comprehend what was happening as Kofi sat across from her, his new wife by his side, both of them looking at her with pity, with coldness. "I thought you should know," Kofi said, his voice distant. "I've moved on, Akosua. I'm married now. I found happiness. I just wanted you to hear it from me." The words hit Akosua like a physical blow. She could hardly breathe. The sight of them together, the woman who had taken her place, was too much to bear. All the pain, all the bitterness that had built up over the months erupted in a single moment. She couldn't stop the tears that filled her eyes, the anguish that seemed to consume her entire being. The man she had given everything to, the man who had broken her, had moved on without a second thought. And now, she was left alone, trapped in a prison of her own making. As Kofi and his wife left the visitation room, Akosua sat there, frozen in place. She had lost everything. Her love, her dignity, and now even her chance at redemption. All that was left was the bitter realization that she had destroyed her own life, and there was no turning back.